This message isn't here to hype you up. It's here to ground you, to tell you the truth without soft edges. Passing the final test doesn't mean life gets easier. It means you proved you can handle reality without excuses. It means you learn how to move without validation, how to stay disciplined when nobody's watching, and how to keep vision alive during long stretches of silence. What follows are not motivational tips. These are principles earned, not given. If you recognize them, it's because you lived them. At some point, the noise fades. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, almost politely. The messages slow down, the check-ins stop. The people who once asked how things were going no longer ask at all. Nothing bad necessarily happens. There's no argument, no clear ending, just silence. And that silence is where most people lose their direction, because without realizing it, they were using attention as fuel. They thought they were working toward a goal, but in reality, they were working toward acknowledgement. When that acknowledgement disappears, the effort suddenly feels heavier, even though the task itself hasn't changed. This is a difficult truth to face because it exposes a hidden dependency. Many people believe they are disciplined, but what they actually are is encouraged. They perform well when someone is watching, when progress is visible, when there is a clear response to their effort. That works for a while. In the early stages of anything, learning a skill, building a business, changing a habit, there is often feedback. People notice the attempt. They comment on the intention. But long-term outcomes are built in phases where nothing is visible yet. The work continues, but the response doesn't. This is not a punishment. It is a filter. Human behavior studies show that external validation is effective for short bursts of motivation, but unreliable over time. When rewards are inconsistent or delayed, most people reduce effort. Not because they are lazy, but because their internal reasons were never fully formed. They were borrowing motivation from their environment instead of generating it from their values. When that borrowed motivation runs out, confusion sets in. The mind starts asking questions it didn't ask before. Is this worth it? Does this even matter? Would anyone notice if I stopped? These questions feel emotional, but they are actually logical responses to a system that was never designed to survive without feedback. When effort is tied to applause, silence feels like failure. The mistake is assuming that visibility and value move at the same speed. They don't. Value compounds quietly. Visibility arrives later, and sometimes never in the way people expect. The work that actually changes outcomes often looks unimpressive while it's happening. It looks like repetition, like restraint, like saying no to things that will feel good now but cost too much later. Consider someone learning a complex skill, writing, coding, trading, building physical strength. In the beginning, progress is noticeable. Small improvements feel exciting. Others might comment on the dedication. Over time, progress slows down, not because growth has stopped, but because standards have risen. Each improvement requires more precision, more patience. This is the phase where applause disappears. Outsiders assume nothing is happening. Internally, this is where the real work begins. The choice here is simple but unforgiving. Continue without reinforcement, or seek something easier that offers immediate response. Those who continue are not stronger emotionally. They are clearer mentally. They understand opportunity cost. They recognize that chasing validation calls focus, and divided focus quietly destroys outcomes. Every time attention shifts toward being seen instead of being effective, quality drops. Decisions become reactive. The work becomes performative. And over time, performance without substance collapses under its own weight. This is why many people look successful early and unstable later. They optimize for attention, not durability. Moving without applause requires accepting the trade-off that most people avoid. You trade emotional comfort now for structural advantage later. You accept being underestimated, overlooked, sometimes even doubted, in exchange for the freedom to work honestly. There is less pressure to impress, more room to refine. Less noise, more clarity. This doesn't feel rewarding in the moment. It feels lonely. But loneliness is not the same as being lost. Often, it is the absence of distraction. There is a quiet discipline in continuing when nothing is feeding your ego. It forces you to confront why you started in the first place. If the reason was shallow, you will stop. If the reason was solid, the silence strengthens it. Over time, effort becomes less emotional and more procedural. You stop negotiating with your mood. You show up because that is who you are, not because someone is watching. This is where consistency becomes identity rather than effort. Everyday life offers small examples of this principle. The person who keeps saving money even when no one knows. The one who maintains physical health without posting progress. The professional who keeps improving skills long after praise is plateaued. These actions don't feel heroic, they feel repetitive and uneventful, but they create disproportionate outcomes over time because they are insulated from external fluctuations. When motivation comes from within, progress doesn't stall when conditions change. The uncomfortable truth is that silence is often a signal that you're doing something right. It means the work has moved past the stage of novelty and into the stage of depth. Most people never reach this phase because it demands patience without reassurance. It demands belief without evidence. Not blind belief, but reasoned commitment to a process that makes sense even when results are delayed. Staying focused in silence sharpens judgment. Without outside opinions constantly shaping your decisions, you learn to evaluate based on fundamentals. You ask better questions. Is this improving the core? Is this sustainable? Is this aligned with where I want to be in 5 years, not 5 weeks? This kind of thinking is rare because it requires emotional restraint. It requires saying no to short-term rewards that feel deserved but aren't strategic. When results eventually show up, and they often do, they feel quieter than expected. There is less excitement, more stability, less need to announce, more confidence in knowing. By then, the habit of working without applause is ingrained. Success doesn't change behavior because behavior was never dependent on recognition to begin with. The real test was never about endurance. It was about independence. Can you operate without constant confirmation? Can you trust your reasoning when no one is validating it? Can you accept that meaningful progress often looks like nothing for a long time? Those who can answer yes to these questions don't just pass a phase, they cross a threshold. From that point on, effort becomes cleaner, focus becomes narrower, and the work starts serving the future instead of the ego. At some stage, everyone is offered the same quiet choice. Even if it doesn't feel like a choice at the time. Take what is immediately available or build toward what is not yet visible. The first option is loud, reassuring, and socially rewarded. The second is slow, uncertain, and often misunderstood. Most people don't consciously choose the first. They drift into it because it feels practical. Bills exist, expectations exist, time feels scarce. So when something produces fast approval, money, attention, status, validation, it feels responsible to accept it. Turning it down feels reckless, even foolish. Yet this is where the long-term consequences quietly begin to form. Instant approval creates a feedback loop that trains behavior. When quick results are rewarded, the mind learns to prioritize what is visible over what is valuable. This is not a moral failure, it is basic human psychology. The brain responds to immediate reinforcement, likes, praise, fast money, recognition. These signals tell the nervous system that the choice was correct. The problem is not that these rewards exist, but that they are often disconnected from durability. They reward appearance, not structure. Over time, this trains people to optimize for speed instead of strength. Choosing delayed respect requires seeing past that conditioning. It means recognizing that some forms of progress cannot announce themselves early without compromising their own development. Consider someone building a career around a difficult skill rather than a popular one. Early on, the popular path offers quicker income and clearer signals of success. The difficult path offers uncertainty and slow feedback. From the outside, choosing the harder path looks like unnecessary struggle. Internally, it requires confidence and reasoning rather than outcomes. You have to believe that depth will matter later, even when it costs you now. This choice is emotionally uncomfortable because it creates social friction. People around you may not understand why you're declining opportunities they would gladly accept. They may frame your patience as hesitation, your discipline as fear, your long-term thinking as avoidance. Humans tend to respect outcomes before they respect process. So when outcomes are delayed, respect is delayed too. This can feel isolating. You may find yourself explaining decisions that don't need explaining, or worse, doubting decisions that were sound but inconvenient. The trade-off becomes clear when you examine opportunity cost. Every quick win carries a hidden price. Time spent maintaining appearances is time not spent improving fundamentals. Energy spent chasing approval is energy diverted from mastery. Small compromises accumulate. You adjust your standards to meet expectations rather than raising expectations to meet your standards. Over time, this erodes autonomy. The work begins to dictate you instead of you dictating the work. Delayed respect, on the other hand, preserves optionality. When you refuse shortcuts, you keep control over direction. This doesn't mean rejecting all immediate rewards. It means being selective. It means asking whether a reward strengthens the foundation or weakens it. Does it add skill, leverage, or resilience? Or does it merely signal progress without creating it? These questions are uncomfortable because they force honesty. Sometimes the attractive option is simply misaligned, even if it looks impressive. There are quiet examples of this everywhere. The business that grows slowly because it reinvests profits instead of advertising aggressively. The student who studies deeply rather than memorizing just enough to pass. The athlete who focuses on technique instead of highlight moments. None of these choices look impressive early. In fact, they often look like underperformance. But the long-term outcomes tell a different story. Depth compounds, shortcuts plateau. What makes delayed respect especially difficult is that it offers no immediate proof. You are betting on principles rather than applause. This requires trust in cause and effect rather than emotion. If I invest here, improve this skill, refine this system, the return will come later. Not guaranteed in timing, but reliable in direction. This kind of thinking is rare because it demands patience in a culture optimized for immediacy. Everything around you suggests that faster is better, louder is stronger, and visibility equals value. Misplaced focus quietly destroys outcomes because it fragments effort. When priorities are divided between building substance and maintaining perception, neither is done well. The work becomes reactive. Decisions are shaped by how they will be received, rather than whether they are correct. Over time, this creates instability. You are constantly adjusting to stay relevant instead of building something that makes relevance unnecessary. Delayed respect builds internal alignment. Your actions match your intentions. You can say no without resentment because you understand what you're protecting. Discipline stops feeling like restriction and starts feeling like clarity. You know why certain options don't fit, even if you can't yet point to a visible payoff. This reduces mental noise. Fewer decisions compete for attention. Focus narrows, quality improves. Emotionally, there is relief in this, even if there is less excitement. You are no longer chasing confirmation. You are working from conviction. That conviction is not loud. It doesn't demand agreement. It simply guides behavior. Over time, this creates consistency. And consistency, applied to the right inputs, produces outcomes that appear sudden to outsiders but feel inevitable to you. When respect finally arrives, it arrives differently. It is quieter, heavier, and more stable. It doesn't depend on constant performance. It comes from reliability. People trust what you do because they've seen you choose structure over spectacle repeatedly. This kind of respect doesn't inflate the ego. It reduces the need for it. You don't need to prove anything because the work speaks without being introduced. The uncomfortable truth is that many people never experience this phase because they exhaust themselves maintaining early success. They become trapped by the identity that instant approval gave them. Changing direction feels like losing status. Slowing down feels like falling behind. So they keep optimizing for what once worked, even as its returns diminish. This is how potential gets capped, not by lack of ability, but by unwillingness to endure the awkward middle where nothing is guaranteed. Choosing delayed respect is not about being noble or patient for its own sake. It is about understanding leverage. Some investments pay slowly but scale. Others pay quickly but peak early. Once you see this pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee. You start noticing how many outcomes are shaped years before they become visible. How many failures are locked in long before they collapse. And how often the difference was a single decision to wait when rushing would have been easier. This kind of thinking doesn't make life easier, but it makes it more coherent. Your actions line up with your long-term vision. Sacrifice has context. Discipline has purpose. You are no longer reacting to the environment. You are shaping your trajectory within it. And while the path remains uncertain, it is no longer scattered. It moves in one direction, quietly, steadily, without asking for permission. There is a phase in growth where effort feels meaningful simply because it hurts. Long hours, constant pressure, irregular sleep, emotional volatility, all of it gets framed as commitment. People mistake exhaustion for progress and chaos for dedication. In the beginning, this mindset feels justified because early stages are messy. You don't yet know what works, so everything feels intense. But over time, something important becomes clear. Pain by itself does not produce results. Structure does. And when struggle is not guided by a process, it slowly becomes a form of avoidance rather than advancement. Most people don't notice when this shift needs to happen. They stay attached to the identity of someone who is grinding because it feels honorable. There is social approval in being busy and overwhelmed. Complaining about how hard things are becomes a substitute for measuring whether things are improving. This is dangerous because it replaces accountability with emotion. You start tracking how tired you are instead of how effective you are. The harder it feels, the more justified you believe you are, even if the outcomes remain unchanged. Human behavior tends to romanticize effort because effort is visible. Process is not. It's easier to post about late nights than to quietly refine systems. It's easier to feel productive when you're stressed than when you're calm, but calm is often the sign that things are finally working. High-performing environments, whether in business, training, or problem-solving, are rarely chaotic for long. Once fundamentals are understood, intensity becomes targeted. Energy is conserved and applied deliberately. This doesn't look impressive, but it works. The turning point comes when you recognize that repeated struggle without improvement is a signal, not a badge of honor. It means something is misaligned. Either the strategy is wrong, the feedback loop is missing, or the priorities are scattered. Continuing to push harder without adjusting approach only deepens the problem. This is where many people get stuck for years. They confuse persistence with progress and mistake motion for direction. Choosing to respect process over struggle requires humility. You have to admit that effort alone is not enough. You have to be willing to slow down, analyze what's actually producing results, and let go of activities that feel productive but aren't. This can feel uncomfortable because it removes the emotional justification you've been leaning on. When you stop suffering dramatically, you have no excuse not to perform well. Calm exposes gaps that chaos can hide. Process thinking forces cause and effect clarity. If I do this repeatedly, what outcome should I reasonably expect? If the outcome isn't appearing, which variable needs adjustment? This is not about motivation. It's about feedback. Systems either produce results or they don't. Emotions don't change that. Time spent on the wrong input does not turn into the right output just because it was painful. Consider someone trying to improve their health. Extreme workouts followed by burnout feel intense and serious, but they rarely last. A simple, repeatable routine done consistently produces far better results. The difference is not effort, it's sustainability. The same principle applies to learning, business, relationships, and personal growth. Sustainable processes compound. Unsustainable struggle resets. When process replaces struggle, discipline becomes quieter. You stop relying on emotional highs to push through. Instead, you design environments that make the right actions easier and the wrong ones harder. You reduce friction. You set clear rules for yourself. This doesn't feel heroic, but it's effective. You're no longer negotiating with yourself every day. Decisions are made once and followed many times. Misplaced focus shows up clearly here. When attention is divided between too many goals, everything feels difficult. Each task competes for energy and nothing gets enough repetition to improve. This creates a cycle where effort increases but progress stalls. People respond by trying harder instead of narrowing focus. The result is exhaustion without advancement. Process thinking forces prioritization. It asks what matters most and cuts away the rest, even if that rest feels important or urgent. There is also an emotional shift that happens when you stop romanticizing struggle. You become less reactive. Small setbacks don't feel catastrophic because the system remains intact. You don't need every day to feel good for the trajectory to remain positive. This builds resilience of a different kind, not the dramatic, survive anything type, but the quiet kind that doesn't get knocked off course easily. Opportunity cost becomes clearer as well. Time spent on unstructured effort is time not spent refining what actually works. Energy spent proving how hard you're working is energy not spent improving results. Once you see this, it becomes difficult to justify unnecessary complexity. Simplicity starts to feel like intelligence rather than laziness. This shift also changes how you view discipline. It's no longer about forcing yourself to endure. It's about respecting your limits enough to build within them. You recognize that consistency beats intensity when intensity cannot be maintained. You start valuing routines that feel almost boring because they remove volatility. Over time, this steadiness produces outcomes that chaotic effort never could. There are quiet observations in everyday life that reflect this principle. The professional who leaves work on time because systems are in place. The student who studies the same way every day instead of cramming. The person who manages finances through automatic habits rather than constant restraint. None of these people look like they're struggling, but their results tell the story. They aren't doing more. They're doing what matters, repeatedly. Letting go of romanticized struggle can feel like losing part of your identity. If you've defined yourself by how much you endure, calm can feel like complacency. But calm is often the result of alignment. When actions match priorities and systems support goals, effort no longer feels chaotic. It becomes directional. You're no longer trying to prove commitment through suffering. You're letting outcomes speak instead. This approach demands honesty. You can't hide behind business. You have to measure what works. You have to accept that some efforts were wasted, not because you didn't care, but because you didn't know better. This is uncomfortable, but it's freeing. Once you stop confusing pain with progress, you regain control over your trajectory. You stop chasing the feeling of struggle and start building something that can actually last. There comes a point where growth creates distance, even when no one intends for it to. Not dramatic distance, not rooted in conflict, but a slow divergence in priorities. You start valuing your time differently. Your conversations change. What once felt normal begins to feel heavy. This is not because you became better than anyone else, but because your direction sharpened, and direction, by its nature, excludes what is not aligned with it. Most people resist this phase longer than they should. They tell themselves that loyalty requires sameness, that staying connected means staying compatible. But human beings don't grow at the same pace, and they don't grow toward the same things. When priorities shift, friction is inevitable. Pretending otherwise doesn't preserve relationships. It quietly damages them. The effort to maintain alignment where none exists drains energy that could have been invested elsewhere. The discomfort here comes from misunderstanding what separation actually means. Letting go is often framed as abandonment or betrayal, but in reality, it is usually an acknowledgement of limits. Some relationships are built for a season, not a lifetime. They serve a purpose at a certain stage and then naturally lose relevance as circumstances change. Holding on beyond that point doesn't honor the past. It anchors you to it. Human behavior tends to avoid this truth because social bonds feel like safety. Familiar people provide emotional predictability. Even when interactions are unproductive, they are known. Growth, on the other hand, introduces uncertainty. New standards require new environments that can feel risky, so people compromise instead. They dilute their focus to maintain comfort. They lower their standards to avoid conflict. The immediate outcome is relief. The long-term outcome is stagnation. Cause and effect here is subtle but consistent. When you spend time with people who don't value growth, your urgency softens. Not because they persuade you directly, but because behavior is contagious. Collaboration shapes attention. Attention shapes thinking. Thinking shapes decisions. Over time, exposure to indifference toward progress normalizes it. You begin to question your own discipline. You second-guess your ambition, not loudly, but quietly, in ways that slow you down without you noticing. This is why environment matters more than intention. You can want change deeply and still fail to achieve it if your surroundings reinforce the opposite. It's not that people actively sabotage you. It's that misaligned priorities create constant drag. You explain yourself more. You justify your choices. You hesitate before acting because you anticipate resistance. All of this consumes mental energy that could have been used to execute. Letting go requires recognizing opportunity cost. Every hour spent maintaining misaligned relationships is an hour not spent building something aligned with your future. Every emotional negotiation drains clarity. Over time, this adds up. Progress doesn't stop abruptly. It slows incrementally until it feels like effort is no longer producing returns. Many people blame themselves at this stage, assuming they lack discipline, when in reality they are surrounded by friction. The emotional difficulty lies in guilt. There is a sense that moving forward means leaving someone behind, and that feels selfish. But growth is not a group decision. You are responsible for your trajectory, not for preserving other people's comfort. Staying smaller to make others feel secure is not generosity. It is self-erasure, and it doesn't actually help anyone in the long run. Resentment builds. Respect erodes. The relationship deteriorates anyway, just more slowly and painfully. There are everyday examples of this dynamic. A person trying to build healthier habits while staying immersed in a social circle that normalizes excess. A professional attempting to raise standards while remaining closely tied to peers who resist accountability. a learner seeking depth while surrounded by people content with surface level understanding. In each case, the effort required to maintain both paths becomes unsustainable. Something has to give. The rational response is not confrontation or explanation, but adjustment. Less exposure, fewer shared activities, clearer boundaries. This doesn't require hostility. It requires honesty with yourself. You stop expecting understanding where it isn't available. You stop forcing alignment. You allow distance to form naturally. This is often misinterpreted as coldness, but it is actually restraint. You are choosing not to create conflict by demanding change from others while also choosing not to sacrifice your own direction. Discipline plays a role here. It takes discipline to walk away from familiar comfort. It takes focus to tolerate the loneliness that sometimes follows. In the short term, you lose ease. Conversations become fewer. Support feels thinner. But what you gain is coherence. Your actions and goals stop contradicting each other. Energy once spent managing tension becomes available for execution. There is also a shift in self-respect. When you consistently choose environments that support your values, your confidence stabilizes. Not the loud kind, but the grounded kind that comes from integrity. You trust your decisions more because they are reinforced rather than questioned. This accelerates learning and execution. Momentum builds quietly. Misplaced focus is exposed clearly during this phase. If you try to keep everyone close while moving in a new direction, your attention splits. You adapt your language. You soften your goals. You delay action to avoid discomfort. This divided focus doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels like compromise. But compromise, when repeated, becomes identity drift. You end up somewhere you didn't intend. Not because you chose wrong, but because you chose too many things at once. Letting go is not about judgment. It's about alignment. You are not declaring others wrong. You are declaring your path specific. This distinction matters because it removes anger from the process. Anger keeps you emotionally attached. Clarity allows you to detach without bitterness. You can appreciate what was while accepting what is no longer sustainable. Over time, something interesting happens. As you create space, new connections form. Not necessarily many, but more relevant. Conversations become sharper. Shared values reduce friction. Progress feels less forced. This reinforces the decision retroactively. What once felt like loss begins to feel like necessary pruning. Growth accelerates not because you found better people, but because you stopped carrying incompatible weight. The uncomfortable truth is that many people sense this need but avoid acting on it. They stay loyal to versions of relationships that no longer exist. They confuse history with alignment. Years pass and the gap between who they are and where they are widens. They feel restless without understanding why. Often the answer isn't more effort or motivation, it's less attachment. This process doesn't end. As you grow, alignment must be reassessed. What fits now may not fit later. This is not instability, it's responsiveness. Long-term thinkers understand that preserving momentum sometimes requires subtraction. Not everything that feels good is good for where you're going. And not every separation is a failure. Some are simply the cost of taking your future seriously. There is a moment, usually quiet and uncomfortable, when excuses stop working. Not because life suddenly becomes fair, but because blaming circumstances no longer produces relief. Early on, external explanations feel reasonable. You didn't start with advantages. The timing wasn't right. Someone else had access, you didn't. These statements may even be true, but over time repeating them changes nothing. They don't move the situation forward. They only explain why it hasn't moved. Eventually, the mind notices the pattern. Every explanation that removes responsibility also removes control. Taking full responsibility begins with recognizing this trade-off. When you attribute outcomes to forces outside yourself, you protect your ego in the short term, but you give up leverage in the long term. If something is not your responsibility, it is not yours to fix. That may feel comforting, but it quietly locks you into the same position. Progress requires influence, and influence begins where responsibility is accepted. This is not an emotional idea. It is a practical one. Human behavior tends to resist this shift because responsibility feels heavy. It forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about your own decisions, habits, and priorities. It asks whether the results you're experiencing are aligned with the actions you're taking consistently, not occasionally. Most people prefer to believe they are doing enough even when evidence suggests otherwise. Accepting responsibility threatens that belief. It exposes gaps between intention and execution. The shift usually happens after disappointment compounds. You try multiple approaches. You wait. You hope conditions change. Eventually, you realize that waiting is also a decision and hoping is not a strategy. This realization can feel sobering, even discouraging, because it removes the illusion that someone else will intervene. But it also introduces clarity. If no one is coming to fix this, then your actions matter more than you thought. Responsibility is often misunderstood as self-blame, but they are not the same. Blame is emotional and backward-looking. Responsibility is practical and forward-looking. Blame asks whose fault it is. Responsibility asks what can be done next. Once this distinction is clear, the concept becomes less threatening. You stop replaying the past and start adjusting the present. The focus shifts from justification to correction. Cause and effect become more visible when responsibility is accepted. If you consistently choose comfort over effort, the outcome will reflect that choice. If you divide attention between too many priorities, progress in any one area will be slow. If you avoid difficult conversations, problems will compound quietly. None of these outcomes are punishments. They are consequences. Understanding this removes emotional drama from decision-making. You stop asking whether something feels fair and start asking whether it works. Everyday life provides constant evidence of this principle. The person who says they want better health structures their day around convenience instead of consistency. The professional who claims ambition but avoids the unglamorous work that ambition requires. The learner who wants mastery but rarely engages in deliberate practice. In each case, the stated goal is real, but the daily choices tell a different story. Responsibility means aligning those two, even when it requires sacrifice. Opportunity cost becomes central here. Every choice excludes alternatives. Time spent consuming distractions is time not spent building skills. Energy spent complaining is energy not spent adjusting strategy. Attention given to things outside your control reduces attention available for what you can influence. These are not moral judgments. They are arithmetic. The numbers always balance, whether you track them or not. Misplaced focus is one of the most common forms of avoiding responsibility. It feels productive to stay busy with low-impact tasks, to analyze problems endlessly, or to wait for perfect conditions. These behaviors create the sensation of engagement without the risk of ownership. True responsibility demands action that could fail visibly. It requires committing to a path and accepting the outcome, good or bad. Many people unconsciously avoid this by staying in preparation mode indefinitely. Discipline emerges differently once responsibility is embraced. It is no longer about forcing yourself to do things you dislike. It is about removing the option to deceive yourself. You become more honest about what you are willing to do consistently. Goals become narrower, but more realistic. You stop overpromising to yourself. This may feel like lowering ambition, but it is actually refining it. Execution improves because expectations match capacity. There is also a psychological shift. When you stop blaming external factors, emotional volatility decreases. Frustration has fewer places to land. Instead of reacting to setbacks, you analyze them. What input led to this output? What variable can be changed? This mindset treats problems as information rather than personal attack. Over time, resilience increases not because things stop going wrong, but because wrong outcomes are no longer interpreted as failure of identity. Responsibility also clarifies boundaries. You become less interested in controlling others and more focused on managing yourself. You stop expecting people to behave differently so that you can succeed. This reduces resentment. The expectations narrow to what you can actually influence. Your preparation, your standards, your response. Paradoxically, this makes you calmer and more effective. Energy once spent on frustration is redirected into execution. Long-term thinking depends on responsibility because the future is built from repeated choices, not intentions. Without ownership, long-term plans remain abstract. With ownership, they translate into systems. Saving money becomes automatic rather than aspirational. Learning becomes scheduled rather than spontaneous. Health becomes routine rather than reactive. These systems are boring, but they work because they reduce reliance on motivation. Sacrifice becomes easier to contextualize as well. When you own your direction, sacrifices feel purposeful rather than imposed. You understand what you are trading and why. This reduces internal conflict. You are no longer torn between what you want now and what you want later. You have decided which one takes priority. The decision removes friction. The uncomfortable truth is that many people avoid responsibility because it removes plausible deniability. If you fully own your outcomes, you cannot tell yourself comforting stories about potential. You must confront reality as it is. This can bruise the ego, but it also grounds it. Self-respect shifts from how you feel about yourself to how reliably you act in alignment with your goals. Responsibility also changes how you view success. Success becomes less about comparison and more about progress against your own standards. You measure improvement, not approval. This makes motivation steadier. External conditions fluctuate, but internal accountability remains constant. Over time, this creates momentum that feels self-generated rather than dependent. The final realization is subtle but powerful. Responsibility is not a burden added to your life. It is a burden removed. It removes the weight of waiting, the frustration of helplessness, and the confusion of misaligned effort. What remains is clarity. You know what is yours to do and what is not. You act accordingly. And while this does not guarantee outcomes, it guarantees something more durable, the ability to respond intelligently to whatever outcomes appear. Passing the final test doesn't mean you've arrived. It means you're ready. Ready to build without noise. Ready to move with patience. Ready to think in years while others think in weekends. Stay disciplined. Protect your vision. Respect the process. And never forget, the reason you see this now is because you proved you could carry weight without breaking. That's not motivation. That's confirmation.